Back in medieval times, there weren't any fridges, freezers, or takeout options, yet somehow these folks managed not to starve or get sick every time they ate. Ever wondered how they kept their meat from rotting or milk from spoiling in a world without electricity? They had some pretty clever ways. Stick around, because what you'll learn might just blow your mind, and maybe even help in a power outage. Let's begin. Salt may not be a very glamorous seasoning today, but back then it was more than just a flavor enhancer. It was one of the most powerful tools medieval people had to battle spoilage. Why? Because salt doesn't just add flavor, it draws out moisture, and bacteria need moisture to survive. No water, no bacterial growth. No growth, no spoilage. People would pack meat and fish in layers of coarse salt until they were practically mummified. We're talking about a full barrel of salt that would soak up all the juice. In coastal towns, salt was basically as valuable as gold. It was even taxed heavily and used in trade because of how essential it was for preserving food. Soldiers, travelers, and sailors relied on salted foods that could last weeks or even months without turning deadly. Salted cod was a staple across Europe. It was rock hard, stinky, and had to be soaked and boiled for hours, but it did what it was supposed to do, which is keeping the hungry soldiers alive. Fun fact, ancient Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt or given money to buy it just because of how essential it was for food preservation. You know that favorite word of many people called celery? This word originates from this practice. Even butter was salted to extend its life. In fact, some monasteries specialized in creating salted butter that could be stored for months. Salting was so effective that it survived even today, and we get to enjoy things like beef jerky, salted anchovies, and prosciutto, which is an Italian salt-cured ham. But what if you didn't like taking salty quite so literally? You could always expose the food to smoke. Smoking wasn't just about making food taste good, it was a survival strategy. Medieval folk discovered that hanging meat or fish over a fire did more than just cook it. It dried it out and coated it with antimicrobial compounds from the smoke itself. Basically nature's antibacterial spray / food taste enhancer. They used cold smoking for preservation, where food was exposed to smoke for days, even weeks, at low temperatures, so it didn't cook but slowly dried and cured. This method made the food last way longer and gave it that signature smoky flavor that's still enjoyed today. The structure of many homes and outbuildings even included built-in smokehouses or chimneys, where meats would hang above the hearth for days. And since different types of wood gave off different flavors, the choice of firewood became part of the art. Oak, beech, and applewood were commonly used wood, and each added their own twist. Both the rich and peasants would smoke their pork, sausages, and herring to stretch the life of their harvest or hunting spoils. But smoke alone wasn't the answer for everything. Sometimes the answer was hidden in plain sight, falling right from the sky or tucked beneath the earth. In colder regions, medieval people used snow and ice like we use refrigerators today. No electricity needed, just Mother Nature and patience and planning. When winter came, it was a mad dash to collect and store enough ice in deep pits. The ice was insulated with straw, sawdust, or even moss. These early ice houses could keep ice frozen well into spring or early summer. Fresh fish, milk, and meat were buried in snow and packed in blocks of ice to slow spoilage. Some inns and wealthier estates even had dedicated ice cellars. The colder the storage, the longer the shelf life, just like in fridges. Any sherbet fans out there? Medieval cooks in noble households would mix snow or crushed ice with honey and fruit syrups to make an early version of this beloved cold treat. In 14th century Italy, there are records of sherbet-like dishes made from snow from the mountains, flavored with lemon or rose water. But of course, unless you lived in Scandinavia, not everyone had a mountain of snow at their disposal year-round. So when the weather warmed up, they turned to the earth itself for help. Before modern insulation, medieval people mastered the art of using nature's natural chill zones, caves, and stone cellars. Built underground or into hillsides, these spaces stayed cool, dark, and damp year-round, which are just the right conditions for storing perishables like wine, cheese, root veggies, and even meats. The cellars weren't just holes in the ground. In monasteries, castles, and farmhouses, they were carefully designed with ventilation shafts to regulate humidity and airflow. Some were 2 levels deep, with specific areas for aging cheese, drying herbs, or fermenting ale. The temperature was often stable enough to preserve food for months, even through scorching summers. In areas where there was plenty of limestone, caves were a huge bonus. These were used to age cheeses like Roquefort in France, which developed its famous blue mold thanks to the cave's microclimate. Monks and cheesemakers understood that certain foods needed the cool, moist air to mature properly. A common recipe for peasants was pottage, a thick soup of root vegetables and dried meats that simmered for hours using whatever was stored in the cellar. But still, not everything could be buried in snow or tucked away in a cave. Sometimes, the best preservation method needed only a bit of sun. How, you ask? We're about to get into that, but before we do, press that like button and subscribe to the channel to feed the algorithm beast and help us reach more curious folks like you. Let's continue. Long before food dehydrators became a kitchen gadget, medieval folks were sun-drying everything. Fruit, fish, everything. They used racks, cloths, and even roof tiles to dry food under the sun. In warmer climates, tomatoes, herbs, apples, and plums were dried and stored in sacks or jars. In colder or wetter areas, they hung thinly sliced meats and grains near hearths or over warm stones. In some regions, large drying towers, known locally as fruit towers, were built to dry apples, pears, and plums. Some notable examples include the drying towers in Boris and Tukuras in the Czech Republic, which date back to the 18th and 19th centuries. These structures could store hundreds of pounds of fruit, stacked on racks across multiple ventilated floors. One popular staple was hardtack, or dried biscuits, essentially rock-hard bread that lasted forever. Sailors and soldiers carried it everywhere. It wasn't fancy, but it wouldn't kill you either. Even dried peas and beans were stored for months and used in hearty stews. Fruits like figs and raisins weren't just treats, they were nutritional lifesavers in winter. And dried herbs would bring some taste to the otherwise bland winter meals and also serve as medicine. Usually not terribly effective, but better than nothing. But drying wasn't the only way to beat bacteria. What if you invited the right kind of microbes in on purpose? Sounds risky, but medieval people mastered that too. Fermentation has been around for thousands of years, and the medieval folks learned to transform food into something not only safe, but better. Fermenting vegetables, milk, and grains gave them entirely new life and flavor, and often added gut-friendly benefits they didn't even realize at the time. Sauerkraut, for instance, was a staple in many medieval kitchens, especially in Germanic and Slavic regions. Cabbage would be shredded, salted, and packed into barrels to let natural bacteria do their work. The result was this tangy, vitamin-rich food that would be eaten all through winter. Even cheese, yogurt, and sourdough bread were all forms of fermentation. They didn't know the science behind it at the time, but they knew how the process worked, so they passed down those methods for generations. Pickling was another go-to method. By soaking vegetables or fish in vinegar or salty brine, they created food that could survive through winter or even long sea voyages. Pickled herring was everywhere in Northern Europe, and vinegar was often made from old wine or ale. Nothing went to waste. Fermentation and pickling were brilliant ways to preserve food, but sometimes nature handed people a ready-made preservative that was almost too good to be true. Sweet, sticky, and practically eternal. Honey! Honey wasn't just a treat in medieval times, it was a miracle. It's naturally antibacterial, super thick, which helps keep out the moisture, and packed full of sugar, which also prevents microbes from growing. In other words, it's the perfect preservative. Medieval people would use honey to preserve fruits, herbs, and even meat. Yeah, even meat. In some regions, cuts of cooked meat were submerged in jars of honey, sealed tight, and stored for weeks or longer. The sugar acted like a natural shield, keeping air and bacteria out. Fruits like berries and figs were often boiled in honey and stored in clay jars. Sound delicious? It probably was. The syrupy preserved fruits were spooned onto bread or eaten during the winter when nothing fresh was growing. Here's a crazy fact for you. Archaeologists have found pots of honey in ancient tombs that are over 3,000 years old and still perfectly edible. People at the time probably had no idea of the chemistry they were pulling, but they sure knew how special honey was. And honey wasn't just food, it was medicine, currency, and a crucial ingredient in another powerful preservative: alcohol. Yep, In medieval times, alcohol wasn't just for drinking, it was a serious tool to keep food from going bad. Whether it came in fermented fruits, grains, or honey like mead, alcohol was used to preserve, disinfect, and sometimes even cook. Strong spirits like wine and ale were poured over fruits, herbs, or cooked foods to keep bacteria at bay. Think of it like medieval Tupperware. This way, foods could sit for weeks without spoiling. People also made herbal tonics by soaking plants in wine, preserving both the herbs and their, healing properties. Jury's out on how effective they actually were. And of course, alcohol itself lasted a long time, making it an ideal way to store calories. Wine and beer were safer to drink than water in many towns, since the fermentation process killed off nasty microbes. It's no wonder even kids drank watered-down ale. Jesus. One clever preservation method involved soaking fruit in brandy or spiced wine, sealing it in jars for winter. Not only did the fruit stay fresh, but it got tastier the longer it sat. Alcohol was flavor, preservation, and medicine all in one, basically the medieval version of multitasking, at least for food. Alcohol was great for soaking fruits and herbs, but when it came to preserving meat, medieval cooks had a few tricks up their sleeves that were even richer and fattier. Confits weren't just a fancy French dish, they were a genius way to keep meat edible for weeks or even months. The idea was simple: cook meat slowly in its own fat, then store it fully submerged in that same fat to seal out air and bacteria. It started with salt. The meat of choice was often duck, goose, or pork, and they would salt the meat and leave it to cure for a day or two. Then it was gently simmered in rendered fat until tender. Once cooked, it was packaged into a pot and completely covered with more fat. That fat would harden as it cooled, forming an airtight seal that kept the meat from spoiling. This method was especially popular in parts of France, where duck confit became a traditional favorite. People would dig into the pot all winter long, scooping out what they needed and topping it off with more fat to reseal it. And if you're wondering, yes, it was delicious. So while no electricity, no fridges, and no modern tech meant the medieval people did not have a variety of foods like we do, they still sure knew how to survive. But tell us in the comments below which preservation method you found the most fascinating. And when you're done, be sure to check out this video on screen now.